All right. Well, welcome everyone to this lecture recital today. My name is Joseph Swift. I'm a doctoral student here at Stony Brook University, presenting today on the application of vocal pedagogy for wind players. This is quite a vast topic, many facets involved, even through the separate terms of vocal and pedagogy alone. But given the time limits of the lecture recital format, today we're only going to be focusing on areas at the beginning of this continuum. The pedagogic areas that we will be covering today include the study of acoustics, physiology, breathing, resonance, and the application of voicing resonance across various registers. As I mentioned before, this is a vast topic, but one whose areas of discussion will span outside of the bassoon, woodwind, and larger wind instrument worlds. Additionally, while this material is aimed largely at the collegiate professional level of ability, there are points throughout the presentation that will relate to students of all levels, as the concept of breathing and making a sound is relevant to a beginner in their first lesson and to the professional refining their basics. You may have to translate some of these practices and theories into flutese or trumpetese. A common issue that exists within the wind pedagogy is the pursuit of the somewhat elusive feat of singing through the horn. Many teachers will urge their students to adopt a singing quality, but won't provide a way to do so in their practice, instead giving them scales, excerpts, and etudes instead to advance technical proficiency. And while technical mastery and accurate pitch are incredible and admirable traits that musicians should continue to pursue absolutely, they should not be the only vehicle that we have for furthering our abilities as instrumentalists and furthermore as musicians. Some key questions we'll be considering are, what does singing through the horn mean? How do we adapt existing practices, such as long tones, to create a beautiful and resonant sound? And how can we create a resonant sound without understanding how the body and instrument work together? Primary sources for today's presentation will include Lily Lehman's How to Sing and William Vernard's Singing, the Mechanism and the Technique. I believe it's actually pronounced technique, but it is a term that he coins throughout the book. It's not a typo, I promise. Other sources are the Nicola Vaccai Practical Method of Italian Singing and Matilda Marchesi Vocal Method Parts 1 and 2. These other sources cover incredibly enlightening ground as well with regards to technical and stylistic exercises and further anatomic breakdown. However, for today, we're going to be focusing on the material, as I said, exclusively from the Lehman and Bernard. Cultivating and applying the techniques from these sources, today's presentation will culminate with the pre-recorded performance of the Lubos Lucas Sonata per fagotto e pianoforte first movement. And we'll be analyzing the voice as a musical instrument. I want to stress that the quotation marks around the word musical instrument are not meant to belittle the idea, but more so to imply that while the voice isn't literally a detached physical instrument, like a bassoon, we will be observing it that way. For singers, the body is their musical instrument, just as the bassoon is to us. There is no external apparatus to project their sound through. The vocal quality is so sought after due to this fact. The goal of any instrumentalist in a performance is to allow the audience to forget that they are holding, for our case, a bassoon, and project their musicality through the ink and through the horn. In this analysis, we will observe the instrument itself, that is the body's organs and muscles, and the method of sound production. How air is taken in and projected out. In order to achieve technical mastery, we must be armed with the technical understanding of how we are creating our sound. Our first topic today will be acoustics. William Vernard begins his vocal manual with a discussion of the nature of sound and how it works. Air is matter. Molecular elasticity is a property of air molecules moving to and from each other, conducting sound from the source of the sound to the ear. This property of elasticity creates waves when the air leaves our lungs and the resultant air that rushes in to fill the space. These compression and rarefaction waves, respectively, create vibrations. Vernard describes that the waves reach the eardrum of the listener, causing it to move in a manner corresponding to the source of the sound, and those results transmitted and interpreted by the brain. He also says that if a series of sound waves is irregular, we deem it as noise mentally. If it forms a pattern that repeats itself, it is musical tone. They may be combined in socially accepted patterns that have meaning, in addition to whatever beauty there may be in the tones. Expanding on that, both small and large groupings of sounds are organized through this methodology. The repetitive and random impact sounds of heavy rain on a rooftop is categorized in our minds as noise. But something with an equal intensity and timbre, things we'll talk about in a moment, for instance, scored percussion material meant to emulate that sound, presents a pattern our brains are trained to identify through meter or rhythmic groupings, which comes to the front of our awareness given our predisposition as musicians. Vennard also believes that musical tone has 5 essential properties. And these 5 essential properties are pitch, the frequency of the impulses from the source of the origin, and also the frequency of the waves beating on the ear, interpreted by the brain, as mentioned. Duration, the length of time that a pitch is heard, described by Vennard, is very important to musicianship, but musicianship is a topic for another day. Intensity, the extent to which equilibrium is disturbed by the sound. Some variables within intensity are the distance from the eardrum or how loud a tone is. Timbre can be understood as the subjective frequency and amplitude of a pitch, varying instrument to instrument. Less scientifically, musicians colloquially coin terms like quality or color of sound. And the final property of musical tone is sonance. Noises mixed within the musical tone, but aren't a direct product of the vibrating object. An example of sonance is that of the buzzing quality produced when sustaining a V or a Z sound. Zzz. This can also be understood as sounds that aren't directly made by your vocal cords or reeds. As a quick aside regarding vibrations, the term we know as A440 regards to the pitch categorized in our brains as A when 440 vibrations traveling 1100 feet per second reach the ear. Octaves are doubled or halved from this number and vary instrument to instrument via the aforementioned timbral qualities for frequency and amplitude native to each instrument and each player of the instrument. An interesting point on that is the fact that the human brain can hear as slow as 15 or 16 cycles per second. Vennard states that less frequent impulses are heard individually incidentally. This gives us one of the parallels between sight and sound, because when one operates a movie projector at less than 15 frames per second, the image flickers. That is, the eye seeing individual pictures instead of continuous motion. The relationship between timbre and overtones is an interesting one. As we can see in the image here, one cycle of compression rarefaction, also as we know it, a sound wave, looks like this. Compression and rarefaction waves being the product of air leaving and entering the body, creating vibrations. However, we as musicians know that our sound are full of overtones, scientifically identified as wavelengths, whose frequency is twice that of its lower correlate. Here, additional wavelengths are presented at twice the speed of the original, with the audible difference, what the ear hears, being portrayed through the thin line in this image, the thicker lines being the original sounds from those two sources. We can see here in the smaller amplitudes of the fourth and fifth overtones how these additional frequencies relate to our primary wave. It changes the shape of the sound wave, but not its overall length, again, that thinner line. As Vennard says, to the ear, this compression rarefaction wave cycle will have the pitch of the fundamental tone, that thin line described and visualized here through the dashed lines, because it will repeat at the same frequency but be a somewhat richer tone sound. In this case, the original wave is referred to as the fundamental or first partial, and the second is the overtone or second partial. The inclusion of more and more of these overtones is what allows the sound to feel richer or more brilliant, and in some unique situations, as we'll hear later, can be the main subject matter of a work. One final point on acoustics. Vennard presents 3 elements of a musical instrument: the actuator, vibrator, and resonators. The actuator is the respiratory system, the actuator being the source of power for musicians, the primary source of a sound. Could also be the bow of a string player. The vibrator for us bassoonists is the reed, and for singers is the larynx. Also for string players, it's the literal strings themselves or the lips of a brass player. The vibrator turns this energy of the actuator, the respiratory system for us, into a series of compression and rarefaction waves. And finally, the resonator. The bassoon itself and the air cavity that the sound within the body is shaped, takes the product of the vibrator and increases its intensity and improves its timbre. In the case of the bassoon, the reed activates the resonant capabilities of the bassoon by stimulating the air column throughout it. Understanding anatomy. The body is a complex structure made of bones, held together by ligaments, and moved by muscles. As mentioned before, the human body is the vocalist's instrument. The emphasis that the vocal text places on the understanding of the body and the organ function that produces the sound they then manipulate is something that wind players should seek to emulate. As Lehman says, science understands too little of singing and singing too little of science, something I think that we as bassoonists can relate to as well. The primary vocal organs as it relates to singing are the larynx, soft palate, and the tongue. Bassoonists should familiarize ourselves with the sensation of adjusting these organs, as greater control will allow for greater adjustment of sound quality. More on that momentarily. As we can see here, there are many different parts of the oral, nasal, and throat cavities. The location of the soft palate and larynx play the largest part in the forming of the air column as it leaves the lungs. The larynx shapes the air directly as it leaves the lungs, often described as the gateway between the lungs and the mouth. The soft palate controls the back end of the oral cavity and the shape that the air takes entering into the mouth, and the tongue acts as the final point of manipulation for the sound before it exits the body, with many ways that it can shape itself in the space between the jaws. Lehman places a great deal of importance on being aware of the function of these organs, saying, even if the pupil unconsciously should produce a flawless tone, it is the teacher's duty to acquaint him with the causes of it, making him describe clearly his sensations in singing and understanding fully the physiological factors that cooperate to produce them. Other important organs to consider for sound production, in my opinion, are the lungs, diaphragm, and abdominal muscles. Understanding how our muscles move and allow us to breathe is important for both vocalists and bassoonists. Let's take a look at the muscles of the ribs. Muscle fibers are binary structures, meaning that they have two functions, contracting and expanding. When fibers contract, they pull ligaments and bone structure that they are attached to along with it. In the case of the rib cage, we have two different groupings of these muscles, the internal and the external intercostal muscles. These muscles are named given their location on the rib cage, the intercostals residing inside the structure, pulling the ribs down and in when exhaling, and those on the outside of the ribs are responsible for pulling them up and out on inhalation. The motion of the rib cage expanding can be deceiving as it visually can promote what is referred to as a high chest or clavicular breath, but often recruits sympathetic activation of the shoulder muscles as part of the pursuit of this function. As we will see momentarily, the lungs expand down into the stomach and fill with the air from the bottom up, where the last reserves of air are responsible for the rib cage's most noteworthy expansion of its breath when properly executed. There are many more interesting muscular connections to the rib cage that help regulate and secure its function, but we'll save that for another day. Now moving to the muscles of the belly. There are many unique abdominal muscles and supporting muscles, but we will observe the abdomen as a singular entity for our own purposes today. As I mentioned before, the function of muscle fibers is to contract and expand. In the case of the abdomen, these muscles are responsible for flattening the stomach, compressing the organs encased within it closer to the spine. The abdomen works hand in hand, figuratively, with the diaphragm, the ceiling of the belly and the floor of the lungs. The diaphragm pulls the lungs down, with the downward motion resulting in movement of the organs within the belly. When the abdominal muscles are relaxed during this descent, you can see the protrusion of the belly as a result of the motion. More on that momentarily. Some teachers advise their students, as a quick tangent, against eating or eating too much prior to a performance, as it creates more matter that the diaphragm has to push out of the way. An increase in stomach fullness causes a decrease in the space that the lungs can displace. If you've ever felt winded after exercising, you've probably found yourself in this position. A lot of sprinters and athletes take this position after strenuous exercise, not because they're disappointed with how they have achieved, but more because they're trying to regulate their breathing. What's happening here anatomically is the removal of the upper chest and shoulder muscles from the breathing process as they're occupied by holding your arms above your head. leaving the intercostal muscles and diaphragm to facilitate breathing regulation more directly. It would take an intentional effort to continue breathing high into the lungs during this position, as the sympathetic activation, as I mentioned earlier, and the resultant tension of the shoulder muscles is taken out of play. The term surrender cobra was made popular in sports, as it usually resembles the "I can't believe it" pose that fans take when their team is suddenly put in a disadvantageous state. Not incredibly relevant to the performance world, but an appropriate name and tangent in my opinion. The final anatomic piece of the puzzle is posture, or the body positioning itself in space. It's important to maintain a correct posture to allow the organs described and detailed earlier to function at their most efficient capability. The spine can serve as a guide for correct posture, maintaining the shape outlined in the standing and seated posture images. As you can see here, the spine is not a straight shape, often misconstrued, as a proper posture shows a line from the heel to the crown of the head. The spine should never take that shape. It's a rounded figure. Any straightness is usually something that can be risky for people to pursue. If tension is present in our posture, it is important that it is identified and its location made aware to the student. If the student is aware of it and tools are provided to practice the release of that tension, it allows for more efficient and safer practicing. For the bassoonist, a proper seated posture is important, given that our seat strap serves as the ball and chain that we have throughout our rehearsals and practice sessions. You can see here that the torso position is from the waist up, again, the same as standing, but the feet are flat on the floor and the spine is not overly concave or arched. A bassoonist should have relaxed wrists, allowing the fingers to comfortably lay on the bassoon's tone holes and keys. They shouldn't be overly rotated in the frontal plane in either direction, as over time, this can become a cause of injury. Practice at home on your own with arms on your side. Lead the wrist to the relative position that they would have on the instrument, allowing the hands to hang in a relaxed way with the left hand palm facing up, right hand palm facing down. Adopting an instrument-specific posture that is both ergonomically effective and safe for prolonged use, with adequate rest and recovery, of course, is essential for prolonged practicing and career longevity. Posture is an important factor in preventing common injuries in the music world, including, but not limited to, carpal tunnel, arthritis, tendonitis, and general sprains and strains. As Bernard says, the main thing is to achieve that happy combination of muscular poise in which the parts which are to do the work are free and alert, and the rest of the body is relaxed. Lastly, when adopting correct posture, it is important to be aware of, as I mentioned before, sympathetic muscular activation and muscle recruitment. When we raise our arms or breathe high into the chest, we recruit sympathetic muscle function from the muscles in the chest and shoulders, which restrict and affect the quality of function that the adjacent structures have via muscle tension, the way that our ribs can function. Speaking of breathing high into the chest, we are now armed with an understanding of acoustic and anatomic function and move to the realm of breath. Since bassoonists and vocalists are students of blowing air, it is useful for us to consider the different ways that air can enter the lungs as well. Let us discuss the different types of breathing. Bernard proposes these different categories for the function of the lungs and the sensation of the breath. It is important to note that these are not the phases of breathing, but how the air enters the lungs. Clavicular, chest or shoulder breathing, costal or rib breathing, and diaphragmatic, abdominal, or belly breathing. I would insert a fourth term to this equation, which we can call regular breathing, something to describe the involuntary process of cycling air in and out of the body that we undergo throughout our regular daily function. This, of course, doesn't have much to do with breathing for performance or producing sound, but it serves as a baseline for us to refer back to. The first type of breath proposed, which is important to note is different from a phase of breathing, is clavicular, chest or shoulder breathing. Shoulder breathing is what we often find those showing the aforementioned surrender cobra combating. Known as a last resort type of breathing, this breath has a physical presentation of heaving chest movements, active shoulder motion, and tense throat sensations. I think it goes without saying that this is not a breath that is meant for active performance. It's not a negative type of breathing, though. it is the most effective method the body has of air circulation, given the shallow depth of the air entering the body. The volume, this happens because the tension in the abdomen and chest muscles require a smaller volume of air to be cycled quickly, taking in oxygen and sending out carbon dioxide. Utilizing the surrender cobra posture takes the chest and shoulder muscles out of the equation, as they are supporting the arms, as we mentioned before, and also elongating the abdomen. This anatomically allows the intercostal muscles of the ribs and abdomen to drive the lung action. The pose allows performers to remember what appropriate breathing mechanics feel like. It is worth noting that some chest motion is inevitable in breathing and should not be avoided altogether, since new issues can arise from that approach. Performers should imagine that their lungs are like a glass of water, filling up from the bottom and only arriving at the top when all other space has been occupied. Our second type of breath is rib, or costal breathing. This is characterized by Bernard as the sideward expansion of the ribs. It's important to develop, as adding a third plane of expansion to what is usually misconstrued as a two-plane via up and down and forward and backwards process of breathing. A great way to practice this method of breathing at home on your own is by placing the palms of your hands on the ribs with the fingers facing down, breathing in with the intent to push the hands apart. The chest should remain relatively still while the belly is encouraged to expand. This belly motion is characteristic of our third type of breath, which should be coordinated and utilized together with costal breathing for overall expansion. That final type of breath is diaphragmatic abdominal or belly breath. The diaphragm receives a lot of attention in the world of breath pedagogy, and for good reason. As we can see here in this video from a YouTube channel, which I will not even attempt to pronounce, the diaphragm acts as both the floor of the lungs and the ceiling for the belly, as we mentioned before. Occupying both spaces, its motion affects these parts of the body simultaneously, as the diaphragm descends during inhalation, flattening and lowering the stomach of the floor of the lungs. It presses the organs residing in the stomach out of the way, resulting in the expansion of the stomach. The abdominal muscles need to relax during inhalation to allow for this expansion to happen appropriately. This tandem of diaphragm and abdomen action gives the process its name. They are called antagonistic muscles, as the action of one muscle's contraction necessitates another's lengthening. The diaphragm can be thought of as the muscle of inhalation and the abdomen as the muscle of exhalation. When we exhale properly as musicians, the abdomen contracts and presses organs back into the body, coupled with the ascending diaphragm to press air up and out of the body. A statement on the importance of this antagonistic process as described by Lily Lemon. The diaphragm must be relaxed after every attack. That is, it must be made pliable, an act which results in the flexibility of all muscular tension of the vocal organs. Exploring these different breath sensations is a great idea. Any teacher or wind compressor, which is a fancy term I made up for those of us who blow air more than the average person, should explore these feelings and the resultant effect that they have on the way they can approach the instrument. Perhaps the shoulder breath presents too much tension to have an elastic resonator in the air cavity. Maybe the rib breath fills the lungs too slow for practical use, and maybe the maintenance or regular breath, the name is a work in progress, is just not enough for us to make use of for longer phrases or to yield proper resonant support. Some example exercises to reinforce proper breathing mechanics for a deep and full air intake include, but are not limited to, what my high school band director called the spooky cave exercise. You put your fingers together. It probably has many names. You've probably heard it from something else, but it's a great exercise nonetheless. If you put your hand in front of your nose, along and in front of your mouth, and you inhale through the mouth, attempting to make the deepest pitch that you can. You can feel the chest open up, and really you get a lot of sideward expansion from this exercise. I invite you to try these, by the way, on your own with, if you would like, the camera off and probably on mute as well. Renowned pedagogue Stephen Maxim has a procedure on reinforcing the mechanics and sensation of the belly breath. You place one hand on your chest and the other hand on the lower abdomen just below the belly button. You take a breath trying to drive the air down into the bottom of the belly. Think of it as as I'd mentioned before, The glass of water analogy. You're sending the air down into the bottom of the stomach, only arriving at the top when all other space has been filled. Placing the hand in these locations allows you to guide the air a little better. Another example is by Montserrat Caballé, shared to us by David Jolly at Stony Brook. We refer to it as sipping the air. Take your index finger and put it on the lip, put it on your lips, and attempt to sip air into the lungs. Taking in this smaller stream really encourages you to drive air down into the bottom of your lungs. This is all a manner of reinforcing proper breathing mechanics. Another way to consider proper breath practice, as proposed by Vernard, is thinking of the breath with the three adverbs in, down, and out. The breath goes down into the lungs, causing the walls of the thorax to expand out. Without the last outward movement, it'll be considered shallow breathing. Proper air intake puts us, the player, in the most optimal situation for them to produce a beautiful and resonant sound. So let us now move on to the topic of resonance. A general misconception surrounding the pursuit of resonance and the term resonance proposed by Vernard is that resonance is most commonly misused as a synonym for desirable qualities of timbre. For bassoonists, we can have different timbres in our sound, bright or dark sounds, but they can still be resonant. Resonance for a bassoon is a sound full of overtones centered within the musical phrase. Given that sound is produced and manipulated inside the body and inside of our minds, much of the instruction and adjustment that teachers provide their students with are through imagery and visual descriptions. Some standard sound proverbs for vocalists and bassoonists and instrumentalists alike are: sing on the breath, support the tone, let the tone float on the breath, legato so that the tones were like pearls on a string, and ground the sound through your feet. It's important to provide these imagistic descriptions of sound as they pull a physiological response from the students. As mentioned before, a teacher should use these, among others, to invoke a desirable response of sound and resonance and prompt the student to tune into what the physical sensation they felt produced it. Vernard asserts two different theories of vocal resonance, but the one most relevant to bassoonists is that of Hermann Helmholtz. For a vocalist, the larynx produces their sound, which the various fleshy bits throughout the throat and oral cavity muffle and mute before it exits the body. This adjustable muffling allows for the performer to bring out different overtones and timbral qualities of sound. This is relevant for bassoonists since we too produce sound, which the instrument, vocal, reed, and body of the player then mutes to allow the most desirable overtone frequencies to ring, the main difference being that the sound comes from the reed. A beautiful example of how the body can mute and highlight overtones is through this video of vocalist Anna Maria Halifa. While we as bassoonists do not literally change the overtones in our sound as she does, as we connect our mouths through the embouchure to the reed and the instrument, which takes the resonance of the reed vibrating, as I mentioned. However, you can hear the change of timbre and quality of sound as she isolates the overtones in this video. Sorry for the spoiler. This timbral manipulation is something that bassoonists and one players alike can certainly employ. I was given the cutoff because I believe I was not sharing my sound. I'm so sorry, everybody. Let's try that again. It wouldn't be a Zoom lecture recital without technical difficulties.
It might have to do with you using your earbud.
Got it now? Great.
There was.
All we missed was her introducing herself. We'll hear it again.
Anna Maria, and I'm an overtone singer, and I'm going to tell you something about polyphonic singing today. Overtone singing is a voice technique where one person sings two notes at the same time. So this was the overtone scale on one fundamental.
It's incredible. As a quick aside on the misconception of how wind players produce and refine their sound, it's important to be aware of the many variables and challenges that are present within any discipline being discussed. Vennard states vocal pedagogy is so much more intangible than instrument pedagogy. And while this is true to some extent, he makes the point that because wind players can say you put this finger down and this finger down to produce that sound, I think that that's a little oversimplifying the process. It's important not to assume something is easier or simpler just because you can see what's happening in front of you. While putting down the first finger on a bassoon gets you on the ballpark of an E natural, many teachers know that it oftentimes doesn't come anywhere close to that pitch when a beginner starts. Just as I, as a bassoonist, am trying to learn from vocalists without assumptions, we should all aspire to enter any setting that way. Lily Lehman proposes the concept of the form in singing through phrases. I adapt that to the bassoon to mean taking into account the quality of sound that we seek to have on the highest and lowest notes of a phrase. As an instrumentalist, it is easier for us to think note to note, but centering the sound, the core of our sound in the musical line by allowing resonance on the lowest and highest points of the phrase evenly allow us to beautifully bookend our phrase. We often refer to the lower note in a musical gesture as a springboard to the upper note. This metaphor coerces the performer to prepare the note on top from the note on the bottom with a beautiful leap. Lehman proposes what I call primary resonance ingredients. Anatomically for them, this is the larynx, soft palate, and tongue, as we mentioned before. Bassoonists use the latter two organs primarily as the reed is what produces our sound instead of the larynx. These can be adjusted by bassoonists and vocalists through phonetic suggestions, thinking of altering the shape of the sound through what she calls auxiliary vowels. Try shaping an ah sound into an o or oo sound. What does that feel like? How does it change the sound coming from your instrument? A great example that Lehman proposes for the sensation of the adjustment vowels she proposes can be found here. Note the locations inhabiting the spaces between and on the tongue, soft palate, and down near the larynx. We can hear in this first example what it sounds like to adjust the shape of the sound more by means of an E vowel shape, closing the space and increasing the overtone presence. Hopefully it comes through over the Zoom connection. Not quite as convincing as Anna Maria, but it's a good attempt nonetheless. In this next example, we can hear what it sounds like to do the inverse, opening the space and dampening the overall sound. You'll notice that by opening the space in the air cavity, the pitch also can drop. While being aware of the presence of these organs and their function in space, an interesting point on the role of mental presence is made by Vennard. To paraphrase, when the body is aware of presence, it generally means that something is wrong. For instance, if we are aware of the presence of our stomach, it can signal indigestion. Awareness of the movement of our musician organs is very different than the feeling of the presence of them. Another example of this sort of sensation is strep throat. A balanced sound exists between two extreme ends of the spectrum, the nasal and hollow bookends. The wonderful, magnanimous gatherer of many superlatives, Professor Morelli's concept of proper tone is that it centers itself within the sound as seen in this image. Visualizing the tone in the center also allows us to visualize what either ends of these spectrums sound, feel, and look like. A nasal sound is thin, pinch, and sharp, while a hollow sound is dull, droopy, and undersupported. Sounds may also be weak and lacking in projection, but for sake of expediency, we will assume that the sound being produced is projecting adequately. A balanced sound is a third bowl of porridge, as it were, in the middle of these two extreme bookends of sound. A nasal sound is not entirely negative. The benefits being projection and presence of overtones throughout the sound caused by the openness and lack of covering. A hollow or dull sound can fill a space with its breadth and sound very appealing, but it can often lack resonance that provides interest for the listeners and can become monotonous over time. Put into more colloquial terms, a balanced sound should have a presence of ring, that is, brilliance via presence of overtone and projection of sound, and depth, full and open, not feeling pinched or tight. It should be the objective of every singer to get as much brilliance as possible and as much depth as possible in the tone at the same time. They are the hemispheres of production, says Bernard. A great description on the importance of having both qualities present. As a master of the vocal instrument, Lily Lehman presents the reader of her book, How to Sing, with a wonderful resource, which she identifies as common causes of defective tone production. I've taken her terminology here and equated it to bassoonese. A pinch tone for us is a sound where the tongue is too high in the mouth. A hollow tone is a flat sound. A flat tone is a weak tone. An open tone is droopy and undersupported. And a hard tone can oftentimes for us sound overblown. Resonance, to this point, has been considered as an isolated concept, a single note resonating in a jar. Yet music exists across the notes. The beauty is in the seemingly effortless leaps and flurries of notes. We categorize the frequencies within different voices and different instruments as registers. Vocal registers are divided into the chest, middle, and head voice, all categorized somewhat by their geographic location and sensation in the body, where the singer feels the presence of these notes. This image proposed here by Lehman provides a beautiful visual example of this concept. While these registers are proposed as separate categories, Lehman says all three form registers when exaggerated, but they should be shaded off and melted into each other. For the bassoon specifically, these registers are fixed locations on the instrument due to the layout of the tone holes. These are divided into the lower register, occurring upon the closure of the E thumb key and lower, also known by us as the pancake key, belovedly. The middle or in the staff register from F2 through F3. The tenor register occurring once the instrument passes over the break of the horn, which is a topic excluded for today but very important to understand. And the upper or stratosphere register, typically reserved for notes from A4 and above, given the usage of the left thumb position. It is important for us to recognize these voicing registers, given that the shaping of proper resonance for the notes within them are all very similar. This allows us to conceptualize the shape of the form that we produce to travel through and between registers, to maintain the center of our line as it fits our musical intention. The opening phrase of the Sluka sonata features a melody moving from the middle to tenor register. Crossing over the break, it can be easy for a bassoonist to focus on the upper notes and cause the lower notes to become thin and lack in depth. Hopefully it came through that the lower notes sounded a little duller than everything else from that approach. Another issue we as bassoonists can run, alternatively, if we focus too much on the lower notes, the upper register can become droopy and undersupported. I'll save you from further torture. Another issue that bassoonists can run into is playing what we call note to note, where we focus on correct intonation instead of focusing on voicing through the line. We should phrase throughout the musical line, being conscious of the quality of sound that the highest and lowest notes should exhibit, executing proper intonation, resonance, and voicing across these registers. We will hear this in the final performance, or at least I hope we do. Based on the example exercises that Layman provides in providing the exercise that she provides in developing and refining resonance, I have adapted that to what we can learn and practice in addition to our long tone practice. Think of it as the resonant partner of intonation. Begin practice by getting your resonance on a single note exactly as you'd like it. If you're not sure where that is, play for your teacher. They should help you identify when it is that the note comes into its sound, when it starts to truly be vibrant and resonant. They should encourage you to identify what physically you did to make that happen. Once you feel comfortable with a single note at a comfortable dynamic, you should focus on moving it from note to note. Transfer the resonance to and between the notes. Don't get caught up on, for bassoonists, the changing in fingerings or the differences in air pressure that different notes need. Focus instead on transferring the resonance from note to note, voicing it. After you feel comfortable moving between notes, add dynamics. Take a comfortable dynamic that you begin at and take it to the softest extent that you can while that resonance is still present in the sound. Once you do that, take it to the upper end and don't let it get too brash. Make sure that you maintain the resonance throughout. After all, this isn't just your regular old long tones. We're focusing on developing and refining the resonance. And Layman stresses the importance of always ending on the softest dynamic. It's important as that necessitates the greatest degree of control. Ending soft is much better than ending hard. After you become comfortable with that, begin to vary the articulation. Practice with different consonants. For a bassoonist, think of a soft and a hard sound. Begin the note and disrupt the note with something like a do sound. Do, 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 do. Disrupt the sound. Go through the same procedure. Do it on one note. Practice transferring it from note to note. And do it within a dynamic flow. Then go to harder consonants, something like a two, where you can feel the disruption of the sound a little bit more presently, but you always want the resonance to be the first thing that you hear, as it should be at the forefront of your focus throughout this practice. And lastly, as Layman says, be picky. This is a very, very important thing. We're focusing on developing resonance, not on practicing air control or, well, I guess it is air control, but not on the traditional things that we focus on with long tones. This is an exercise in developing resonance and should be done in addition to those studies, not in place of it. Other important areas that were considered in the performance of the movement you're about to hear include vibrato, articulation and pronunciation, phonetics, phrasing and imagery, just to name a few. Keep some of these in mind as you listen to the performance. These areas will hopefully be expanded on in future presentations. See if you can find anything that speaks to you from these categories. I hope you enjoy my quarantined performance of the Sluka Sonata for bassoon and piano, first movement. To summarize today's presentation, the idea of singing through the horn means the emulation of the vocal approach to music. This is pursued by resonating and vibrating the sound through each phrase, maintaining the form through and across the various registers that each instrument has. However, if we truly want to adopt a vocal approach to our performance practice, we need to place further emphasis on the study of the instrument and the awareness of our bodily functions. To achieve a balanced and resonant sound, it must be rounded by means of ring and depth. This can be refined through the exercise proposed by Lily Lemon that I adapted for the bassoon. And finally, this is only the beginning. This project will hopefully be expanded to the other areas I mentioned before. And please feel free to reach out if you're interested in the future presentations. Thank you very much.